Hi friends and family, I am giving a second shot at creating a YouTube video. Some things I have learned: show my face, even if I'm not wearing makeup. People don't want to just look at a green thing the entire YouTube video. Today I am going to show you all how to assemble an Edwardian corset. Okay, so you may have seen in a previous post that I did that I have already cut out all the pattern pieces, so everything's done there. And I've also done sort of a basting stitch across the front of all of the panels to help me when I place my tape. So typically you use like a twill tape when you're doing corsetry to insert the boning so that it has something to hold on to. So I've already done that. I've already cut out the pieces. Today, I'm gonna assemble them.
We begin by attaching the side front panel to the center front panel. To do this, you want to use your sewing gauge to measure out 5/8 of an inch from the edge of the center front panel. You then want to measure 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the side front panel. Make sure that your stitching lines line up and then pin the panels together, clipping small notches at the most curved parts of the fabric. Before stitching, check your pinned panels for any obvious bubbling and smooth those areas. Clip any remaining curves that look stretched. Stitch at the 5/8 of an inch mark, making sure to carefully go around curves so as to maintain your seam allowance. It is important that you always stitch from top to bottom throughout the corset making process. Failure to do this could result in bizarre stretching. Before turning or pressing your two panel pieces, go back and make sure that curves are clipped and remaining threads are cut off. Now it's time to attach the hip panel. We'll do this in the same way that we attached the two front panels. Remember that pinning the hip curve to the waist curve can be very tricky. Essentially, we are pinning a concave curve into a convex curve. The two probably won't play nice. The key is to trim the concave curve every 1/2 inch so as to ease it into the shape of the convex curve. As you go, it will become obvious that you will need a lot more pins. This is normal, and don't fret if you have to pin every 1/4 to a 1/2 inch. Once you've finished your pinning, go back in and trim additional notches as needed. Space out your pins to accommodate the apex of the curve and generally check for smoothness all around. Stitch again at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Remember to start from the top and stitch down to the bottom, even if it means that you have to work on your wonky side. Go slower if you need to. Curves like this are tough. After stitching, bring your pieces back to your workspace and take the time to clip all of the extra pieces of thread. Take a moment to generally admire your amazing work because, oh my goodness, that was tough, and get ready to move on to one of the most difficult parts of traditional Edwardian corset making. Before we attach the side section, you'll notice that there is a hip seam that will need to be sewn in during that process. For this to be done correctly, we will first need to prepare that seam as if it were being finished. Remember that remaining 3/8 of an inch that's sticking out on all your seams? That bit is folded over to conceal the raw edge of the 1/4 inch seam and then sewn. You'll notice that I've used a small piece of pattern drafting paper to back my fabric when starting a new stitch. This can help so that your machine doesn't A, eat your fabric, or B, eat all of your threads and create a nasty mess on the back. Turn it over once completing sewing and clip any extra threads. You can pull that paper off easily by folding it and then tearing it along the serrated edge as shown. Finish this seam by sewing 1/4 of an inch away from the original stitch line. Because the goal of this step is simply to conceal the side hip seam within the side seam, you only need to take your stitching about 1 inch in. Once you're done, bring your work back to your table and clip any remaining threads. Again, use the same process to pull the paper off, and voila, you should have a beautiful professional looking seam, or at least the start of one, here at your hip curve. Attaching the next couple of panels will be fairly similar to what we did with the first two sections. Here, we're attaching the side front with hip curve to the side panel. As with previous sections, make sure that you measure out that 5/8 of an inch and that you lay the other piece of panel up against it at 1/4 inch from the seam line. As a reminder, we're doing this really bizarre seam pinning so that at the end, we can create a garment that has a beautiful seam both on the inside and on the outside of the corset. Doing this serves two key purposes. One, it's aesthetically pleasing, and two, it's more comfortable against the skin. Continue your seam at 5/8 of an inch as with previous panels. As before, after sewing, turn the fabric and check for any bizarre stretching or bumps. As you begin working through the side back section and the back section, you'll find that you'll need less pins to make sure that these pieces come together correctly. This is because as we move to the back, we start to accommodate for a more convex curve as associated with the back. Stitch as usual with the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then go back and check to see if there are any clippings that need to be done. Again, you shouldn't need to do this because of the shape of the back. Turn your fabric and check again. Does everything look the way it's supposed to? Pin the final center back panel to the side back panel and stitch at the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance as before. Turn the fabric one more time and check for any remaining oopses or little threads that need to be clipped. Now it's time to finish those seams. As you'll see here, I've already completed 2 of the seams on this side panel. To do this, turn that remaining 3/8 of an inch over to cover the smaller 1/4 inch raw edge. Pin the turnover so that it doesn't slip and stitch over the original panel joining stitch line. You may need to clip small notches in the larger seam allowance to ease the process of turning it over. Again, you'll need to stitch at 1/4 inch so that you're stitching on the original panel joining seam. This should leave you with a flap of sorts sticking out from the seam, as you will see here in a moment. Use a tailor's ham or a rolled up hand towel if you don't have one to iron out and smooth the seams along the curves of the corset. You'll want to do this so that when you sew the final stitching lines to finish the seams, they don't result in any bubbling, which can often happen if things aren't ironed between steps. To finish the seams, pin down that little flap so that all raw edges are concealed underneath. As you pin, remember to constantly smooth the fabric. Use your fingers to ease the fabric into the shape it will sit on the body. When you are finished pinning, your fabric should not sit flat. Rather, it should begin to take that hourglass shape. As you sew, attempt to maintain that shaping as you run the fabric through the machine. This probably sounds bizarre, but as you practice, you will get the feel for manipulating the fabric. Last but not least, turn the fabric over and check those seams. Make sure they look nice and crisp and straight. So one final line to make sure that you have the double-lined seam style as shown here. When you're finished, turn your fabric, check everything, and take a moment to pat yourself on the back. Use your tailor's ham one more time to press out all the seams and really start to get that corset shape going. Congratulations, you have assembled half of the corset base.
And here we are, the beginnings of an Edwardian corset. Now remember, this is just the base of the corset, and number 2, this is muslin. So typically we're using muslin to create a fit sample so that we can modify it to fit ourselves. I've used a stiffening, like a fabric stiffener spray, and then ironed it so that it achieves that nice stiffness here, so you can kind of get an idea of what will end up happening in the hip area. And you'll notice that the waist just dramatically curves in. You can actually buy mannequins that are designed for, what's it called? Lingerie. Lingerie making. But I kind of prefer just to work on a modern, typical mannequin because, you know, body image, right? Let's keep this around instead of the tuning. Anyway, good luck in your sewing adventures. I will try to make a video showing how I insert the boning and the busk. See you soon.